Welcome to Bleeding Edge. Super Dave here with part 4 of the Newbies Guide to Progressive Rock. If you haven't already viewed the first 3 chapters, I recommend you go back and do that now, then come back to this one. You'll be ready for it, maybe. Unless you're already somebody who has been into the prog world a little bit and you're looking maybe to expand into the metallic side of prog, because that's what we're doing. This time we are delving into progressive metal, also known as prog metal for short. This is where power and aggression and the edge of heavy metal is melded to the technicality, eclecticism, and the adventurousness of progressive rock. So it's a pretty impressive blending of styles and genres right there. Definitely not what I would say for the faint of heart, but if you've gotten through those other chapters, or again, if you're somebody who's already familiar with standard progressive rock and you're interested in getting into the metal side, then I would say you're probably ready for this list of recommendations. Essentially, the artists presented here have been taken prog up a couple notches, and they've crafted some albums that are a collective punch in the face, basically, by comparison to what has been traditional progressive rock. I'm not going easy on you guys here anymore. If you're new to prog, the gloves are off, basically. It means I'm not restricting and looking for things that avoid overly complex or unusual arrangements, or avoiding epic length extended compositions, or mind-bending concepts, and lots of genre-bending heavy metal. If you've gotten this far, if you are here, you're ready for this. Let's just put it that way. Don't be scared. You're going to be fine. As in the previous episodes, I'm going to be presenting these recommendations in chronological order. I'm not necessarily recommending albums that are necessarily universally considered to be examples of each artist's best work, but those that I think will appeal most to the neophyte and which I personally feel most comfortable recommending. Let's be honest here. I don't know everything, and I am not overly familiar with everything, so I want to avoid recommending something that I don't know very well. I know most of it very well, but I don't know all of it. That being said, a lot of these will indeed be considered among each artist's greatest albums. That's almost a given in many ways. I'm going to be very careful not to throw duds your way. So trust me when I say these aren't necessarily the classics as defined by the group at large, but they are, in a lot of cases, they'll turn out to be, just because that's what I picked. So before we dive into that, quick reminder, don't forget, if you could, toss me a like if you enjoy what's going on, if you enjoy this and the other stuff I'm putting out, and if you could subscribe and follow along with future releases, that would be wonderful, appreciated. You can find the links below in the description to my social media, and that's where you will also find the link to my all-prog station on Live 365, The Expanse. Nothing but prog all the time, rock, metal, the whole thing. Now, let's get into it. My top 5 recommendations for getting into progressive metal, presented chronologically. So we're starting way back in the 80s. Queensryche, Operation Mindcrime, released in 1988. So arguably, this is where progressive metal really crystallized as a subgenre and got its start. Not necessarily because they did something progressive with metal first. There are others that were already starting to blend those two genres, but largely because at that point in time, they pretty much did it the best as far as a true metal band. The accolades this album received initially compared it to Pink Floyd's The Wall, The Who's Quadrophenia. Yes, it is exactly that good. This one pulls together a deeply layered and cynical story about drugs and corruption and self-styled revolutionaries. Yes, very serious piece of music and very dense. And it did it as a masterclass of metal at the time, integrating elements of thrash and punk and pop metal and British new wave of heavy metal all into one kind of gut punch of an album that still had enough hooks and accessibility to allow it to connect with the masses at the time. This propelled the idea forward that metal could achieve things on the level of the classic prog rock masters into the public consciousness, mostly via MTV, where it got a lot of heavy play because I think overall it largely probably, I think, terrified broadcast radio. At least it did in the Philadelphia area. I didn't hear this stuff on the radio. Maybe others in other parts of the country did, but not around here. You got this from MTV, and that was it. Operation Mindcrime is very rightfully hailed as a classic, not just of prog metal, but progressive rock in general. So, not to be missed, really. If you're looking into progressive metal, this is not to be missed. It is essential listening. But for those of you who might like to try something a little more refined, a little less angry, their follow-up Empire is arguably just as good and features the spacey ballad Silent Lucidity, which was a hit on radio. Also because it was largely, a lot more mellow and wasn't talking about drug-addled assassins. More radio-friendly material, let's be honest. All right, next up, we have Dream Theater, Images and Words, 1992. I have seen it stated that Dream Theater is to prog metal what the Beatles are to pop music. Not kidding. Maybe you could say that's a bit of an overstatement, because obviously the Beatles are the Beatles. But this album really truly marks the turning point in the subgenre where everything can be classified as before Dream Theater and after Dream Theater. I'm not kidding. They really had that much of an impact, and everything that's come since in some way ties back to them and probably this album. It effortlessly, I talk for a living. It's the album that effortlessly blends elements of metal and classical and improvisational jazz into this epic collection of songs that range from headbanging, heavy and crunchy to gorgeously melodic, all with thoughtful and philosophical lyrics, some of them even referencing Shakespeare, if you can buy that. The level of musicianship on display is honestly just about unparalleled throughout, and the band to this day still ranks as the standard of virtuosity against which all others are judged. They really are. They're that good, especially in their classic configuration, which kind of came later. No disrespect meant to Kevin Moore, but Juden Rhodes is an amazing figure altogether in and of himself. So this album does contain their one and only hit song, which is Pull Me Under. It was huge on MTV at the time, but again, too long, too unusual, too complex to ever make it to radio anywhere where I heard radio. It's a lie. On occasion, the local hard rock station will pull it out, but it's rare. It's very rare. So, yeah, no other hits, but they're a prog metal band. Prog metal bands really don't have hits. Let's be honest here. They really kind of don't. Again, like Operation Mindcrime, the album is hailed as a classic of progressive rock overall. It's not limited to just metal. This will easily fall in top 20, top 10 all-time lists consistently. Maybe one exception, for Dream Theater, that is. If you really want to challenge yourself and jump ahead a little bit, try their 1999 album, Metropolis Part 2, Scenes from a Memory. It is actually a sequel of sorts to one of the songs on Images and Words, and also, really, to many, it's their magnum opus, considered one of the greatest prog albums of all time. So these two can often be interchangeable for some folks in terms of how they rank and how they fall on a list. Honestly, you can't go wrong with either of them. Either one of them is great. I would just say Images and Words is maybe for the neophyte the easier one to segue into than the other one, which is basically an album-long song. Just say it. All right, next up, Fate's Warning, Disconnected from 2000. Fate's Warning is actually another of the early godfathers of prog metal. Generally, they're considered, along with Queensryche and Dream Theater, to be part of the holy trinity of progressive metal. They were contemporaries of Queensryche back in the 80s, pretty much developing along the same timeline and just kind of arriving at the same place from different starting points. But their best work really, honestly, I think came later. Whereas Queensryche blossomed in the late 80s and into the early 90s, I think Fate's Warning hit their stride best in the late 90s, early 2000s, as they were transitioning from really a band that was heavily influenced by power metal into a more contemporary progressive outfit. These guys perfected a moody and a heavy style of prog metal, and this album, I think, is really an example of that at their pinnacle. It's probably a bit more restrained than some of the others on this list, eschewing the general bombast in terms of complex arrangements and virtuosity that you normally associate with the subgenre. It's just not really their style. They do something a little bit different, a little bit more straight ahead. And they have these electronic and industrial flourishes in this album that really kind of individualizes their music, particularly at that time. And the deep part of their work is really more in their lyrics, in this particular case, dealing with themes of loss and the price of fame. So if you want an alternative to this one, the album preceding it, A Pleasant Shade of Grey, is also a really good choice. And it's kind of a point where people feel that they had really, really crystallized their unique style and hit their stride, the beginning of that. It's similar in style, and it was, again, a notable turning point for the band from their previous more commercial albums or more power metal influenced albums. I just tend to think this one's maybe a touch better. It's a little bit more perfected in this newer style they were heading in at the time. Also, worth noting, many folks might also point you towards their third album, Awaken the Guardian. That one was from 1988, again, hitting right about the same time Queensryche hit with Operation Mindcrime. For me, honestly, this one just doesn't resonate as much, which is why I didn't recommend it. There is a historical significance to it in the early days of progressive metal, and, you know, they were contemporaries of Queensryche. They both developed along similar timelines with similar influences and things, and I think that's what we heard. They just, for some reason, for someone that was familiar with Queensryche first and then got to Fate's Warning later, they came across sounding a little derivative of Queensryche. And I think that's, honestly, it's got to be purely an accident. It's striking me that the fact that they both came out around the same time, they were both hitting like their third, fourth album around the same time. I can't think that they were trying to copy Queensryche or trying to sound like them. I think it just was coincidence that they shared similar influences and similar styles were, part of that time in rock's history. So I just don't think that is one of their best albums, and that's why I wouldn't put it forth. But it does get a lot of love, and it does have a lot of historical significance, just not for me. Just one man's opinion. Sorry, Fate's Warnings fans. I do love the band. I don't love this album. That's all it is to it. All right, interesting fun facts about them, though. This album featured keyboard player Kevin Moore, who was one of the original members of Dream Theater, so there's a little bit of connective tissue, and additional connective tissue in the fact that both this album and A Pleasant Shade of Grey were produced by Terry Brown, who was best known as the producer or engineer for the first 9 studio albums of Rush. So again, their prog connections are absolutely there. Moving on, next we have Opeth, Ghost Reveries, released in 2005. Now, this one is perhaps going to be the most jarring to those of you not used to harsh death metal growls in the music. Don't be scared, it's going to be okay. So not only is their vocalist Michael Akerfeld a talented growler, and he nails that Cookie Monster death metal growl, he also has a wonderfully lush baritone crooning vocal style when he digs into the clean vocals. And he mixes those in with the music here about on a 50-50 ratio, give or take, with the harsh singing. So that part just shows you his talent. And it's amazing to me, especially the first time I heard it, to hear as the first song immediately, Ghost of Perdition, immediately just booms right into you, tramples you over like a herd of buffalo with the death metal growls and the riffs and the heavy metal, blah, blah, blah. And then it shifts into this clean vocals a couple minutes in and a quieter passage. And you're going, wait, this is the same dude? Yes, it's the same dude. He's that good of a singer, really. Even later, just to show off a little bit more, he brings out some falsetto passages, and you really at that point get a very clear idea of his full vocal range. It's amazing. Absolutely amazing. But beyond the vocals, you have some of the most intricate and cinematic music you're likely to hear anywhere, as it moves from pummeling metal riffs to lilting acoustic passages, and back again, shifting moods and tempos and textures on a dime as if it's nothing. As if it's nothing. Truly, honestly, some of the most amazing metal you will ever hear. And in the end of the album, it all wraps up with this lovely ballad about, loneliness and grief and death. Let's be honest, the whole album is really something of a story of ghosts and the supernatural, just as the title suggests, but the final song, nonetheless, is just beautiful in its sadness. It really is. Others may point to their landmark 2001 album, Blackwater Park. I'm sure that up to this point, many of you were familiar with them going, wait a minute, you didn't say Blackwater Park. Yes, I didn't say Blackwater Park. And I can't argue against that one as an excellent choice as well. It is brilliant and deserves its place in history, both of prog and of prog metal specifically. This one I'm pointing to because really for me, it's where I started with Opeth. And honestly, I just like it a little better. Maybe because that's where I started. It's often said that the first Opeth album you hear is going to be your favorite. So that could be it. That could be my influence. I think there are some added aspects to this album that I like just a touch better than Blackwater Park. But let's be honest. You could go with either one. Either one is an equal choice, but for me, this one is bookended by Ghost of Perdition and Isolation Years to open and close the album respectively, and those are among my favorite Opeth songs, and they're wonderful. So, either one, but I recommend Ghost Reveries to start. And finally, rounding out our top 5, somebody that's basically inherited the modern generation of prog metal royalty, we'll say. Don't know what that means, just making it up. Haken, The Mountain from 2013. This is the album where Haken truly found their own distinctive voice and asserted themselves really as the heirs apparent to Dream Theater. The influences are definitely there, from the complexity of the arrangements to the wide range of influences on display with this album. Where Haken really differentiate themselves is in their playfulness and fearlessness in integrating their own influences with pop hooks and choral digressions. So many bands in the prog genre, and often more so the prog metal bands, seem to take themselves, or at least take their music or present their music very seriously. I mean, look back at this list here. Among the suggestions I've given is an album telling the doomed story of a drug-addicted assassin misled by grifters, meditations on death and ghosts, and musings about the abstract concepts of urban life and urban living. But these guys, Haken, really openly have a bit more fun with their concepts of insect royalty, and includes self-made Muppets in their videos, and their recent tour featured a King Louie from the Disney version of Jungle Book, a King Louie version of the Dapper Chimp that was on their most recent album cover. They like to be playful. They like to goof around. They made Hawaiian shirts for themselves based on the recent album cover. You don't see that a lot in prog metal outside of a Devin Townsend concert. So that's one of the reasons these guys, I think, really differentiate themselves. But at the same time, this album still has all the bombast you expect from the genre. Doses of pop melodicism, choral arrangements reminiscent of Bohemian Rhapsody, improvisational jazz meanderings, and cinematic epics. It's all there. And this was them really establishing themselves as a force to be reckoned with. And they've moved basically to the top heap of recent years. They are one of the bands to which others are getting compared now. That's impressive stuff. And if you think I'm overstating it, just look at their release from last year, Fauna, and look and see how many year-end lists included that album, many of which at their top of it, like in their top 5, top 2, or top 1, me included. Frankly, of the two, I prefer Fauna. I think it's them really maturing and just pulling in all their influences into something that just integrates everything they've done. And it's got a wider blend of prog and pop sensibilities to it compared to the Mountain. Really, either one is wonderful. For an introduction, though, something a little more straightforward, I recommend the Mountain. But jump ahead to Fauna if you want to. It's a wonderful album in and of itself as well. So, there is the 5 albums I recommend if you want to try getting into prog metal. Now, extra credit time. As always, I offer an extra credit opportunity. For those of you that found you enjoyed the above, or maybe just want to go the extra mile and keep exploring, I honestly had a tough time choosing where to go with this one this time. I tend to favor the metal side of progressive rock, and it's nearly impossible to get more complex and proggy than the albums I've already presented, especially when you're talking about Opeth and Dream Theater. And there's a plethora of other bands out there that are just as wonderful, really, in many ways, that I could easily have suggested, such as Between the Buried and Me, and Periphery, and Tesseract, and Earthshine, and Meshuggah, and Tool, and recent newcomers like Okrust, and The Anchoret, and No Spoon. There's so much out there, and it was really difficult for me to put this list together and limit myself to the 5 ones I would put out there. And I struggled to find just one band to share as extra credit, without at least feeling like I was slighting someone else. It was a tough choice. But nonetheless, I finally manned up, and I did choose none of those. But I went with something what I think is a bit unexpected. Coheed and Cambria, Good Apollo, I'm Burning, Star 4, Volume 1, From Fear Through the Eyes of Madness. That's a mouthful. 2005. Yes, it's a ridiculously long, overblown title. I can't get away from that. A lot of times I think you could just call it short, Good Apollo, I'm Burning, Star 4. But probably have to say Volume 1 because there's volume. It's just go with it. So what Coheed and Cambria have done is something I don't think anybody else has ever done. At least I don't know of anybody else that has. They have gone beyond the concept of a concept album, the idea of a concept album, and they have crafted a concept career. So out of 10 studio albums, all but one of those tell one long, continuous story about the Amory Wars. Their story. And no, the Amory Wars isn't a real thing. Don't go searching through Wikipedia for historical references. It is, in fact, a fictional story. It's too long to get into here, but it's an amazing feat what they have done. And over the years, the story has been transcribed into comic books and a novel. It's truly amazing, and they themselves are very unique. They have this blend of elements of metal and emo and pop and punk and alternative into something that is really, truly their own and yet really very accessible, even if the subject matter gets a bit dense here and there. Not a band that's gotten a ton of radio airplay, but they really should get more than they have done. Out of all those albums that are all telling the same story, I suggest this one because really it's considered one of their best, and because it also contains their best known and best loved songs, or at least a lot of them. Welcome Home, in particular, is a song that's been used in movie trailers, and you may have already heard somewhere along the line and didn't realize what you were hearing. These guys, definitely a high-energy burst in the midst of a genre that can often be a bit on the dour side. So, nice change of pace. That's why I decided to put them in here. Now, a bit of historical perspective and a final album you might want to check just to get into the earliest roots of progressive metal. And that would be King Crimson, Red, released in 1974. So we're kind of coming back to where we started with the first video, with King Crimson once again. But it's worth noting that it's arguable that the original roots of progressive metal started with this classic album from King Crimson. Metal at that time was still really in its infancy, and King Crimson was assuredly a progressive rock band. But this album was so comparatively aggressive in its complexity and its harshness that it is really cited very frequently as an influence for prog metal and metal bands in general, as well as some more unexpected artists like Nirvana. Believe it or not, Kurt Cobain cited this album. So honestly, I've often thought the same about their song, 21st Century Schizoid Man, from their first album. But that was just one song. So this is a full album representing them at their harshest, I guess, basically. And that's why it's usually pointed to as perhaps one of the earliest progenitors of the subgenre known as progressive metal. And interesting to note. So you might want to check that one out as well, just to hear what that's about and hear for yourself the connective tissue, as I like to say. So let me know your thoughts in the comments here. Did I miss anything? Is there something you think I went off the rails on a little bit? Any other suggestions you might have? Do you want to debate with me about whether I chose the right album for each of these artists? And maybe the artists are correct, but you think a different album would be a better choice. That's all cool too. It's what we do. It's fun to talk about this stuff, and it's fun to share. So I hope for those that are very new to this, you go out and check these albums out. And I hope you really enjoy them. I hope you really dig them, and it helps you get further into the progressive rock and progressive metal rabbit hole. For those of you already familiar with the genre and with these albums, your suggestions, your feedback, absolutely welcome. Absolutely be interested in hearing it. Just drop some messages in the comments section if you don't mind. And hey, while you're at it, don't forget, like and subscribe if you don't mind. So that's all I have for you at this point in time. What I will do at this point is just remind you, never fear to deviate from the norm. Keep it proggy. And this is Super Dave, signing off.